Good morning, and again, welcome to Anthropology 4310, Theories of Culture. Last time, we covered a lot of material, actually, again, concerning the actual, or trying to give you a kind of insights into actual thoughts that a cultural relativist would have, giving you the wherewithal to apply that kind of model and do an analysis of your own. And we did a quickie kind of thing, if you'll forgive that expression, with looking at American culture, especially American so-called middle-class culture, in a kind of off the, very superficial kind of way. And when we talked about what are the values of American society, and we showed how some of those values are interdependent with one another, how they're mutually interdependent, how they reinforce one another, how they are kind of display a harmony, if you will. They're not in contradiction to one another. And if a society, displays a set of values and they're all more or less harmonious with one another, then Ruth Benedict would have said, and Edward Sapir would have said, it is a genuine kind of society. If they had, for those societies that have a higher incidence of conflict, of values that are sometimes, in this situation you use this value system, but in another situation you use a different value system, those are the kinds of societies that she would have said were spurious, or he would have said were spurious. And we talked a lot about that model and how you apply it. So now you've had the Eskimo, you've had the Plains Indian culture, much more limited extent. We talked about the Southwest Indians, meaning the Hopi in more current day terms, in past times, the Anasazi. We talked about, then we went to, I talked a little bit also about Northwest Coast Indians, and then we've also talked about the American middle class. So we've given you various and numerous examples now of using this kind of cultural relativistic approach, and the way in which the anthropologists of that era thought they were being scientific, thought they were being value-free. And it is a tool that you can use that way, by the way, even though cultural relativism in more recent times has come into some disrepute, just like everything eventually comes into disrepute. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but I don't want to spend too much more time on cultural relativism. My intention today is to get on to functionalism and the British School of Anthropology, but I still have a few more comments I need to make concerning what we've been saying and doing with cultural relativism. So, how has it come into disrepute? Well, it's useful, as I just said. It's a way that you can talk about another people and their values and their behaviors and remain somewhat objective. It does give one that ability. In other words, personally, I'm revolted by a practice like female infanticide, and certainly if I were to be present when that was occurring, I would not be calm, cool, and collected as I hopefully was when I was talking about it in class. It doesn't mean that the anthropologist doesn't have personal feelings and their own value system. It's an effort using cultural relativism as a tool, again, as a heuristic device, that you come or have a greater ability to treat other cultures, other value systems in a value-free context. And I think that's the utility of it. Now, how does it come into disrepute? I think because it was applied in such a widespread fashion. No culture was seen as meriting criticism or being judgeable, if that's a word. For example, more recently, anthropologists from many different theoretical perspectives have criticized cultural relativism because it's easy to do now with lots of hindsight, but also because of its widespread application. Meaning, let's take an example. You would take something like the Nazis, and you could do a cultural relativistic analysis of it, and you could say how you could understand what they were doing in a value-free way, being non-judgmental of Nazi culture or subculture. Well, fine, except it is a set of values or a system of values or whatever that injures or brings injury to many members of a particular group or different groups. So that anthropologists have become more critical of cultural relativism in that way. It was so bland. We just accepted everything and anything. It took a stand on nothing in terms of saying this is what humans might be about versus this is what humans are about. In other words, we took, if human behavior was present in one way or another, we justified it using cultural relativism in a culturally relativistic presentation. So it's just saying, that, for example, murder is a act, a behavior also that in many different societies is condoned. You have culturally approved systems for committing murder. And not just something that may sound extreme like Nazis, but in our own culture. We have cultural context in which homicide is approved and other contexts in which it's not approved. And, why is one different than the other? And why employ a heuristic device like cultural relativism to make those kinds of generalizations that everything's okay? There is such a thing as pathology. There is such a thing as behavior which brings injury to lots of people. And so anthropology in more recent years, I guess, has come, it's called critical anthropology in theoretical circles. And it just means that anthropologists are beginning to take more stands, morally speaking. So in some ways they've become less the enemy that your mother warned you about in your Baptist church. And again, I say that humorously. I hope no one's taking offense. But again, when people cite moral relativism as a indictment of anthropology or of this approach, I would say anthropologists have joined you to a limited extent. I still see cultural relativism and the way in which we've applied it as being a tool, as being a pragmatic tool that you can use to analyze value systems, behaviors of other peoples. And it encourages you, it allows you, it permits you to see it in a more value-free context. But there are limitations even to what anthropologists will accept. So, that being said, now I'll ask you if you have any questions, because we've kind of come to a natural breaking point here, because we're going to be switching from cultural relativism to functionalism in the British School of Anthropology. So, do you have any questions, major or minor? Yes, our student at the site, yeah.
Okay, my question is about organismic culture. I'm not clear on that.
Organismic culture. I'm not either. Organismic is a word, a label that refers, I don't know when I said it, so I don't remember the context, but I do know that throughout anthropology there have been biological models for anthropological models in theory, social science models in theory, from Spencer, Tyler, and Morgan to Ruth Benedict to as you'll see among the functionalists just in a moment. It's also an organismic model. And all that really means is just a fancy 75-cent word, a 6-bit word for describing a biological basis to discuss social systems or cultural systems. So that's really all it refers to. It means it's been likened or compared to an organism in the way in which it's structured. So if you remember back when I talked about cultural relativism and I said it could either be described as organismic or mechanistic. In both cases, whether you're emphasizing its mechanistic qualities or its organismic qualities, you're still emphasizing its systemic qualities, that's organized into a system, that those systems are divided into parts, that those parts are mutually interdependent with one another, and that system is seen as functioning, it's seen as somehow living, it's seen as somehow those parts are interdependent with one another, and they're humming like an engine on the one hand, and they're functioning like a body on the other. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Good.
Any
Yeah,
other
thank you.
questions? No other questions? You all ready for your exam next week? Okay. Just like to throw that out. No. Well, you just get it off the internet, the website. Yeah, you have next Thursday too, sure. Right. Well, I mean, you have the class outline in the notes now, so I'm going to pay less attention to the review. I would expect next time, for review purposes, that if you want to bring questions after looking over your notes, that that's an appropriate time. And it also would provide help for the home viewers. Again, if you can ask the questions they would ask, were they able to? Of course, they could also communicate with us by email if they have a question that you all don't ask. But it kind of becomes delicate to ask those questions once we've posted the exam, and the exam will be posted, I think, as of Thursday. After the lecture, it will be posted. Yeah, right. So again, I'm just encouraging you to bring questions next time if you're not having it this time. Yes, Sean? It's going to be posted under cultural materials again. There's another heading there that says course exams, I believe, but we haven't been able to discover how you get into there. So since we all know how to get now into the course materials, we'll just post it with course materials. So that's where your exam will be after Thursday's lecture on Thursday. As soon as Sean can get it there. Because we already have it made up, I think. Right? Yeah. Okay, any other questions? All right, let's just get on then with functionalism and the British School of Anthropology. This is going to be a little confusing to you, I think, because it's going to sound real similar. And I think that's the stance I'm going to use in this lecture, and that is I'm going to kind of wean you off of cultural relativism, so to speak, and take you to functionalism. And the larger picture, there were some things occurring, some events occurring in that larger world that we all lived in, if you were alive at that time, during and after the Second World War, that brought about similar viewpoints, I think, in England and in the United States. And in the United States, obviously, it was called cultural relativism, and cultural relativism, importantly, has that diachronic aspect to it. Diachronic means it has an historical aspect to it, that somehow change is involved, whether it's that earlier historical particularistic model or if it's the later systems model as found in cultural relativism. But whatever, history is there, change is there, what have you. So, but in the larger world, the British didn't want history in their model. And in some ways, some scholars have talked about that it's synchronicity. In other words, it's a synchronic model as opposed to diachronic. Its synchronicity, to use a fancier phrase for it, is related to the fact that they had an empire. And they were trying to come up with a functional basis, or a theoretical basis, better said, to justify and rationalize the fact that they were the members of an empire. And anthropologists, by the way, were employed by an ethnographic institute or whatever they were called. That's not what it was called, but it was, it was part of the colonial government. It was a part of the government of the British Empire that dealt with colonial affairs. So that anthropologists were direct employees, if you will, of exerting those imperialistic values that go with colonialism and other factors of world history that we now deplore as social scientists, whereas in a previous era we might have applauded them if we were back in the 19th century. So there are many ways in which functionalism and cultural relativism are seemingly very similar to one another. But in this one aspect, they're decidedly distinctive from one another. The British approach, which is called the synchronic approach, a snapshot approach, and I'll talk about that in a second, is to be contrasted with the culturally relative approach, which is diachronic, which again is just a fancy way or a complicated way of saying, which is what we're about in theory, of saying that one involves change and the other one doesn't. The first one, diachronic, doesn't, or does rather, importantly involve change, and the second one, synchronic, absolutely doesn't want to have any notion of change. And I'll give you an example of that in just a moment to kind of illustrate it for you so you'll better appreciate it. Synchronic is like a snapshot kind of thing. It's almost as if they are taking a snapshot now in Bolivia, and they take another one in this classroom, and they take another one in, we'll say, Russia, in Svensk, if there is such a city, I think there is, or Omsk in Siberia. I happen to know that because one of my professors came from there back again when I was in school. And all those things would be synchronic with one another. It would have been taken at the same time. There would be no historical explanation involved. It would just be current. It would be contemporary. It would be synchronous. It would display synchronicity. And how is it that one can talk about the important aspects of a society or a culture and the way in which it's structured that you wouldn't bring history into it? Well, let's think of an example. And the one that's most commonly used or is often used is this notion of having buttons on a men's jacket. For once, I'm wearing a jacket with buttons on them. And I see on this jacket there are 4 buttons here. Now, if you were a historical particularist kind of anthropologist, if you were a cultural relativist, this would have an important historical dimension to it, especially historical particularism, because there would be those stylistic notions that you would want to look at here. 4 buttons versus some years there are 3, some years there are 2, some years there are 1. I would imagine there might even be some years in which there are none. But one can look at it. This is a fairly recent jacket, so one can look at this and say, and can tell that it's fairly recent, because I think most jackets sold now would have these 4 buttons on them, or not these 4, but 4 buttons arranged similarly as this one is. But what does the historical origin of this or the history of this tell you about its function in today's society? And I'll throw that out to you. What does an historical explanation tell you about buttons on men's jackets? Anybody? Does it tell you anything? Well, it's good you're not responding. Yeah. Because it doesn't. It doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't give you any illuminating insights or insights. Okay, well, let's leave it as insights. For example, I'm trying to think. Oh, I know. I'll give you the historical account now of buttons on men's jackets, at least as I've heard it. Its historical authenticity may be somewhat questionable, but it's at least the version that I've heard and makes sense for this class, and that's what works. Whatever else I am, I'm pragmatic. A long time ago in the 15th or 16th century, there was a king in England, either King Louis the 16th or the 15th or the 17th, whichever, that had a palace, like French kings had palaces. And this was a particularly court-minded French nobleman or king, monarch. And he decided he wanted to really have an era that was refined, cultured, full of pizzazz and a style. He wanted to be known for all those reasons, and so he decided to redo his palace thoroughly. He had everything repainted. He had everything cleaned and swept up. There were no those dust balls that occur in my apartment on occasion, or my house rather, on occasion, and I'm sure other people I know's houses on occasion. They just didn't have those because they were thoroughly clean, and he certainly had a staff of servants that could do those kinds of things and to see that they were done. So he did that, and And when he was finished and everything looked really well because it was just newly painted on everything, all the woodwork was painted with gold paint and it looked really great. And the pale blue or whatever they had that would make it royal. That would make it more Wedgwood. And that could be, I guess, a royal view of the palace. But anyway, he did that, and then he realized there was something wrong because most of the staff, most of the nobility that were entertained in the palace, of course, came from the nobility or the upper class. But the people who staffed the palace, the people who were the servants, the people who were in the army, who were in the guards, etc., came from lower classes in French society. And they weren't always as well versed, if you will, or as well articulated in the fine nuances of French upper class culture. So he, was whistling down the staircase that they had, that the French kings came down, kind of a winding staircase. Obviously, I'm making the scene up, since I haven't been in a French palace recently. And he was very happy and whistling because all the good work he had been done and taken care of and what have you. And then, suddenly he was just shocked and taken aback because, these blackguards, if that's the appropriate phrase, that were his staff, that were his guards, there was crud all over their sleeves. And he had just bought these new tunics, these new uniforms. But, back at that time, if you were from that class of folks and you had a runny nose or you had a cold or something and you wanted to take care of it, you just wiped it on your sleeve. And so after a while, there was kind of a buildup there, like a plaque and on your teeth, except this was on their jackets, their new tunics, and this was not acceptable. So he decided he would put something there that would prevent them from doing that. So he put little brass structure, creations there that if they were to do that, it would just rip their nose open. And, in the sense of cutting it, or on your flesh. So that's the historical explanation that I've been given in terms of a kind of a historical or particularistic set of notions of, very trait-oriented, etc., kind of view where it would explain for you why men today have buttons on their jackets. But why do you have buttons on your jackets? I don't notice anyone really doing that unless they're about 3 years old and their mother hasn't thoroughly educated them yet in the finer nuances of being middle class in American society. So does anybody have any notion about why we would have buttons here today? I've already kind of talked about it, but without drawing your attention to it in that way. What did I say earlier about buttons and having 3 buttons and 2 buttons and 1 button? What was I kind of giving you a preliminary hint? Yeah.
I'm thinking that there's a fashion change over time, and someone who was trained in fashion. That you're speaking, please. Thank you. Someone who's trained in fashion, especially men's suits, would not be cognizant of how many buttons were appropriate at any point in time for the suit that he is, that he's looking at.
Yeah.
And so over time that changes, the styles change, that's all.
And if you were a member of fashion industry, you would think everybody would have those values. I mean, talk to the person who sells suits, for example, at Foley's. They assume everybody has this fine sense and this fine tuning of knowing that once you see my jacket and you see those 4 buttons, you know this is a recent jacket, right? And given the fact that I have a fairly new jacket on, I certainly wouldn't put on a jacket with 2 buttons. That would mean it's 5, 6 years old. And you would know that. Well, quite frankly, I don't know that value system. I mean, I don't even know what style and fashion is because, men's fashion is easy to use this way because it changes so little and the changes are so non-startling that, for the most part, that most of us really don't take any notice of it. We just go out and buy a coat or a suit if and when we need it. A family member dies, we buy a suit for the first time in 10 years. Hopefully your family members don't die any more often than that or ever. But that's the historical explanation I just given you. Now I'm starting to get into the functional explanation. We're talking about the way in which buttons contribute to the ongoing maintenance and well-being of our society. And if I were to give you a general definition off the top of my head, non-textbook, it would be functionalism is a concept or a theory that encourages seeing societies and cultures, but more societies, as ongoing and as being organized to promote the well-being of the members of that society. So again, let me regroup here and try to come up with a better definition for you. Functionalism is a theory or concept which promotes the notion that society is structured in a way that promotes the well-being and I can't think of the other part of it now, I just said it. Anyway, it promotes the well-being, ongoing maintenance of that society and or culture. It is similar to cultural relativism in that the elements are seen, it's already torn off, as interdependent. And interdependency here means the same for functionalism as it did for cultural relativism. The groups, the societies, the cultures are seen as constructed or construed in such a way that they mutually support one another, they're harmonious with one another, they're interdependent with one another. I was commenting in the graduate course I teach yesterday evening that conflict theory was really very late coming to anthropology. There are lots of sociologists, for example, that dealt with conflict theory and dealt with it much earlier than anthropology did. Marx had little or no impact on anthropology except maybe in the last 2 decades or 3 decades. Whereas in sociology and other social science disciplines, it had an impact much earlier. And part of that was this notion that of interdependency, of mutual harmony, of reinforcing one another, of being supportive of one another, of showing the ways in which societies were constructed such that they provided for the well-being of their members and for the ongoing maintenance of that society or culture. Now, I haven't gotten into any particular theorist yet, and I probably, I don't know when I'll get to that, but it may be today, it may be next lecture. But this generalized definition is that it is a construct, or it is a notion, it is a conception, it is a theory, it is a hunch that societies are constructed such that they provide for the well-being of their members and they provide for the ongoing maintenance of that society. So that's a way of talking about functionalism, I think, that helps you to see it immediately as having lots of similarities to cultural relativism as a construct. Its systemic qualities, its notion as being tightly integrated. Integration, by the way, is a word that can be used for functionalism as much as it's useful to discuss cultural relativism. It's seen as being composed of elements that somehow become interdependent with one another, but not over time. Not over time. If anything, again, to emphasize that notion about change and the fact that functionalism is described as synchronic, whereas relativism is described or referred to as diachronic, one can say that functionalism I think, have I misspelled this? Interdependent. Yes, I did. Forgive me. And on television, too. But the next thing to talk about is that not only is it synchronic and not diachronic, but it is ahistorical. It's not anti-historical. It's not non-historical. It is ahistorical. It is without regard to history. It doesn't see history as something to be against. It just doesn't see that it's a part of a necessary explanation or for describing or understanding cultural systems. So it's ahistorical, without history, is what that means literally from the Latin. But I'm trying to give you what it does mean. It goes beyond saying that cultural relativism is diachronic, British anthropology is synchronic. It's also telling you that this is an ahistorical model for looking at cultural systems, or again, social systems. I think, again, what it is, I keep coming back to social systems because when one is looking at British anthropology, what you often have to recall is that they really didn't it's not the same as American anthropology at all. If you were to go to a university today, or if you would have gone to one back at the time of when functionalists were reigning supreme, same era as cultural relativism, you would have found that they have a very different kind of anthropology department. They would have had anthropology, it would say anthropology up there, but under anthropology you would have had no concern for archaeology, you would have had no concern even for linguistics, maybe more so a little bit, just for, again, pragmatic purposes, because British anthropologists are well known, especially at this time, for writing their ethnographies or their accounts of other people and using native terms. So they did like to come across as being articulated with the knowledge, the language of the people in which they studied. I don't know necessarily that they knew the language of the people they studied so much as they were trying to impress you with using words that were in italics, so they could give you the native term and go and launch into a long discussion about this native term and its meaning. But again, I don't know that they actually went out to think of an example of people here, the Nuer, and really interacted with them that well in terms of in terms of interacting, speaking the language that the Nuer people spoke. And that would be Evans Pritchard would be the anthropologist I have in mind. Pritchard. Or any other, Meyer Fortis and Fortes, and his discussions in many volumes on the Talensi. I mean, there are all kinds of books here that do this, and it's illustrative. But it doesn't really give me a notion that they were so linguistically oriented that it would have been a subfield that it is important in British anthropology, as it is in American anthropology, and is seen as a necessary subfield of a department of anthropology. And again, they have no concern for archaeology, relatively, I think, little concern for linguistics as a discipline, and no concern given over to biological anthropology. They were only interested in, as you'll see when you look at either of the two major spokespersons for British School of Anthropology, which we'll be discussing in a while. One would be Malinowski. That's Malinowski. I know I seem to write clearly sometimes, but when you try to copy what I'm saying, it's not as necessarily as clear. And the other major proponent of a functionalist perspective is Radcliffe. Oops, I just misspelled his name. Radcliffe Brown, which I sometimes in my notes anyway refer to as R-B. It's just easier and quicker to write, so you might want to adopt the same thing, only we'll know that you mean Radcliffe Brown. And it's not Mr. Brown he. That's a Britishism there, and that's a thing where, you know, if you come close to being knighted or you join the nobility of the aristocracy, the Queen knights you, and you suddenly have a hyphen to your name, and you become, he's Sir Arthur Alfred Reginald Radcliffe Brown. I don't know if he were originally Mr. Brown or Mr. Radcliffe. It really doesn't matter. In the literature, and he's referred to as Radcliffe Brown, and that's his last name, is that hyphenated version that you got here. So I don't want to see anywhere Mr. Brown, he, but rather Radcliffe Brown, or RB will do. Anyway, that's a minor digression. So these are the two major proponents, and whichever one we might want to go into their theoretical perspective, it would be a theoretical perspective that doesn't take into account archaeology, biological anthropology, and or linguistics. Although in their writings, in Malinowski's case, I take it back. There you do get a lot of information from him about Trobriand language. And Trobrianders were one of the major peoples that he studied, and he wrote 2 or 3 volumes on the Trobrianders, major one being Argonauts of the Western Pacific. I think it was published in 1922. His field work was done in 1914 to 1918, which corresponded, as some of you don't remember, with the World War I, and we'll get into that a little later as well, what that significance that has. But again, they saw anthropology much more narrowly than American anthropologists see it. See, they would have said they were holistic, though. They would have been holistic in the sense of a system being holistic, and a system reflecting that interdependency that we talked about earlier. But they wouldn't be holistic in the sense of a four-field approach to the study of human behavior as American anthropologists would have been and are. Some American anthropologists. I would say still a majority of American anthropologists. So they, again, in short, they have a much more narrowly focused view of what anthropology is about and what they intended to study. You've got to remember that, again, that their being in the colonial office had lots of implications for what they did. There was the reason they were doing ethnography in the first place, and the government was paying them to do ethnography, was to control the people they were writing the ethnographic descriptions of, and the functionalist interpretations of. So it wasn't as high-minded as American anthropologists like to see themselves in this period. I can remember even back when I was a graduate student, which was well after cultural relativism was at its peak in terms of popularity, that American anthropologists used to tout themselves and pat themselves on the back and be kind of self-serving in terms of letting everybody know that they didn't depend on the government as much for their research, and that's true up to this point. And they weren't like sociologists; they hadn't sold out. In other words, in the British system, you had government influence coming about because these people were direct employees of the government. In the American system, in terms of today and in more recent history, say previous history in sociology, and to some extent anthropology, but much less so, you had fewer anthropologists who were hired as employees of the government. The kind of support that government gives social science in this country has been in terms of grants. And anthropologists used to say, we're much better than sociologists because we don't get grants, which would fall on deaf ears or very non-receptive ears today if we were to talk to a university administrator. One of the reasons that, and forgive me if I'm somehow revealing the hidden secrets of university systems and the way the universities are structured, but the reason that psychology is given so much attention on this campus and has the amount of resources that it does, say compared to anthropology, is simply because psychologists have large grants. Whereas an anthropologist, I think, how much money did I get when I did my study of Ecuador? $3,000 for the 2 years I was there. Of course, I could live for $3,000 in Ecuador for 2 years too, but this wasn't like some of the professors in psychology here who get $5 million, $6 million to do a study of, say, smoking behaviors among teenagers in Houston. I don't know if any teenagers, and forgive me, have benefited from that kind of study. But on the other hand, it's in the nature of it. It's in the nature that this is, psychological research is very pragmatically oriented. It's problem oriented. It's problems that government defines for researchers, and then the individual social scientists come to the trough, so to speak, to get their share of that. And anthropologists aren't very good at playing that game, even today. Even today, when anthropologists have become much more like sociologists and psychologists in this context, an anthropology grant is always for much less money. And somehow I don't want you to get the notion that because psychology grants are for much more money that somehow they're rooking us or taking us. No, their research does cost that much. It probably has that kind of benefit to it. It's worthwhile for the government to invest in it that way. But anthropology grants, they wouldn't figure that importantly. If I got a grant for $200,000, I'd be on top of the world, and so would the university. Yeah. Your microphone.
What about Columbia University in the city of New York? They have a great history of anthropology, and all the big names just about have been there at one time or another in anthropology. How do the anthropologists, how does that department fare in present times for receipts from grants? How does that compare?
Excuse me, I didn't mean to talk at the same time. The same characteristics apply. Anthropologists still receive much less monies, and psychologists at Columbia would receive much more monies. But again, it's the nature of the research. Anthropologists are really, at least especially cultural and social anthropologists, are really much more comfortable discussing small-scale societies. Even if we are to do a study of a society or a culture in an urban context or a modern society of today, we're only going to be looking at 2 blocks as opposed to the city of Houston. Most anthropologists wouldn't say, I'm going to do a study of Houston. When I did a study of HIV, or when I was doing my studies of HIV, I didn't do HIV in Houston. And today, if you were to become a researcher on HIV and anthropology, you would study African American women and children, or you would study gay men, or you would study anyway, it wouldn't be the bigger picture, it would be a smaller picture. I think success always in anthropological research always has to do with an ability of a researcher to bring it down to the smaller picture, to refine it, to focus down, to more narrowly circumscribe the objects of research. Whereas because we are non-mathematically inclined, non-statistically inclined, compared to other social scientists. Though I hope good-naturedly kind of jabbing at psychology earlier, their kind of research is much more wide-scale, much broader, much more greater numbers of people are involved. They take the more statistical approach. They take the larger approach. They take the approach that requires quantitative analysis, whereas anthropology, whether it's of the British or the American variety, would be much more qualitative in its approach to, and in its models to studying human behavior. Quantitative, qualitative. So psychology, economics, sociology are much more quantitative. And those social science disciplines that are much more quantitative in their models and their approaches to the study of human behavior would also then require much larger sums of money to do the research, because they're studying much larger numbers of people. Whether they're studying patterns of cigarette smoking, or whether they're studying patterns of drinking, or whether they're studying pathology, or whether they're studying manic depression, whatever it is they're studying, they study greater numbers of people, and it requires a statistical kind of background and training, and it requires a much greater group of people to support that kind of research other than the principal investigator himself or herself. But this is not true of anthropology. So, getting back to the topic of functionalism and the kinds of research that they do, the kinds of characteristics that you can give this school or approach to the study of human behavior. Quickly reviewing, they are synchronic, they are interdependent, they are ahistorical. And although qualitative and quantitative is what I most recently talked about, it's true of all anthropology. Cultural anthropology or ethnology tends to have this qualitative notion as part of its very identity. So it's not something that separates functionalism from cultural relativism, or is an important thing that functionalists themselves would put forward. They would just assume that you knew they were qualitative in their approach. It partly has to, I don't want to get off into qualitative and quantitative, so I'll stop that, cut myself off, and just go back to functionalism. So it's, yes, you have a question? Your hand on your microphone.
Synchronistic and ahistorical, those two adjectives describing functionalism sound same to me.
Well, they are. I mean, they refer to the same.
Why do we use them both?
Because if I told you synchronic and just left it there and said it was a study of contemporary society and had no, it wouldn't get you into this notion of being ahistorical, that it was without history. The reason I emphasize ahistorical as a characteristic of the functionalist approach is that it's not, some people have said they were anti-historical. Other people have said that they didn't know history well enough to consider it. No, they wanted to come up with a model that allowed or permitted them to be non-historical or without an historical element in their model for explaining human behavior. So it's important in that just kind of enriching your notion of what functionalism is about and how they stand vis-a-vis this notion of history. Because history is just real natural for Americans to do. We're very linear in the way we look at things, and we always think of things as having beginning, middles, and ends, and it's just a part of the American's viewpoint in terms of anthropology, at least, so that whether we're talking about 19th century anthropologists, or whether we're talking about historical particularists, or in the same school but later on the cultural relativists, all, and even to this day, every major approach in anthropology has some notion of history, some notion of change, some, hopefully, way of accounting for change. You know, one of the major criticisms of functionalism, and we're kind of jumping ahead of ourselves, but was that it couldn't account for change. You know, on the one hand, they said, we want a theory or an approach that allows us to describe other systems, other cultures, that doesn't take change into account, and we need that. And the way they justified it was because the people, many times, they were taking into account or they were describing, no one knew the history of. So on the one hand, they said we need to come up with a model that permits us to not have to take into account history or change. On the other hand, other people, other scholars later on, immediately turned around and said, well, that's what's wrong with it. It doesn't allow us to talk about change. And if there's anything that, you know, Westerners think the world is about, it's change. And if you're going to have any kind of insight into, quote, applied programs of anthropological research or what have you, you're going to have to talk about change. Changes in behavior, changes in values, changes in ways of doing things, changes in way of solving problems, etc. But that's not what the functionalists were about. They weren't about a world that was familiar with change yet. They did most of their research in the early part of this century. If you'll notice, Malinowski, I said, did his research among the Trobrianders, and actually Radcliffe Brown among the Andaman Islanders, both out of the colonial office of the British Empire. Both of them were doing it at about the same time in terms of world history. And even though the World War I was going on, it really hadn't impacted that dramatically the way they thought. I mean, after all, Malinowski was already in the among the Trobrianders when the World War I started. And being, you'll look at his name, I think you'll notice it's not very British sounding, Malinowski. He was Polish by birth, and he was a naturalized citizen of the British Empire. Well, one of the things the British government did during the First World War is anybody who was naturalized that way, was not a natural-born citizen in Britain or in England, they weren't allowed to move around very much. So he couldn't leave the Trobrianders or the Trobriand Islands or that area of the Pacific. So he's, as you'll find out later, he's always given great accolades as being the supreme example, the apogee, the paramount ethnographer, field worker, participant observer. It's because he couldn't get away. It's not because he had such a predilection or saw such a great necessity to stay among the Trobrianders that long or that in that day. He stayed there 4 years. That's a long time for a Westerner, especially a Westerner from the upper middle class or upper classes of British society or American society to try to do, because you just didn't take other cultures that readily. It's interesting. Functionalism is a perspective that allows you also to be somewhat, quote, value-free, that allows you to be non-judgmental. But of course they were extremely judgmental, these functionalists, especially this Malinowski fellow. And he was judgmental in the sense that later on, his wife, much more recently, in the 60s, I believe, or early 70s, allowed to be published his diary. Other people considered it such a personal document, they didn't want it to be published, and especially once they read it, they didn't think it was appropriate or ethical that it was published. Because in it, he refers to these natives, and forgive me here, he used the term in the book, niggers. He didn't mean blacks. It was a generic term for talking about people that were unacceptable. And if you were in the British upper class, or in the educated class, I should say, you didn't assume these people were your equal. I mean, if we look back at history and see the influence of certain kinds of concepts, and we talk about those 19th century anthropologists, one of the things they retained a notion of from the 19th century to the 20th century was this notion they were a member of a civilized group of people, and being civilized is what it was all about. And certainly if you're going to talk about civilization and a people being civilized, they very importantly thought of themselves as being civilized, and every other lesser, quote, developed people in the world as being somewhat less than that. And so they would be referred to in those generic terms. So I always think of James Conrad, Gunga Din, Heart of Darkness, all those kind of images apply here. And Malinowski could be James Conrad if he were in the literary world. He could be describing a people among whom he felt somewhat inarticulate with. He didn't really fit well with them. And so in his diary, where he was writing about the way he actually felt and how what was going on in his daily life, he was homesick, felt lousy, he felt miserable many times, and he would talk about that, and he would talk about those y'all can't use the words. I always one negative word today that's not politically correct. But he used lots of terms in his diary that would have been unacceptable at the time it was published, and yet it reveals, I think, his humanity in the sense that he also was a product of his time. This is the way people from his class thought about other people in the world. But again, as many times before, I digress. But it's just to give you this, or reemphasize this notion that they also were an approach that attempted at least to present themselves as being value-free, as being without prejudice, about bias in their examination of other groups of people. So it was okay to have this diary on the one hand. It kind of provided him some kind of psychological release. But on the other hand, it was never intended to be made public, and yet its publication was probably one of the great benefits of leading to, I think, what is today the postmodern approach. Because it helped to destroy lots of the myths that anthropologists continued to hold about themselves and about their own capacity to do these value-free studies in a scientific, quote, observable way. So again, they share in these notions that the cultural relativists have. They want to study other people. They want to study people who are lesser developed than they are technologically speaking, but they wanted to do it in a value-free, scientific, empirical way. So their model is interdependent, as I've talked about. It is ahistorical. It is, as the young lady asked much earlier in class, organismic, and we'll get to that in a second. And it is holistic. Holistic, again, in that sense that I talked about. It is not holistic in the sense of the four-field approach to the study of anthropology, but it is holistic in the sense that it studies the interdependency and sees that all elements of a society or culture are somehow interdependent with one another. In fact, if anything, it is overly interdependent that way. I'm just reaching my pocket to see what I pull out, and of course, something very common that you would find in anybody's pocket, I assume, or at least a male's pocket. Maybe in females' cases, it would more likely be found in a purse or a bag or something like that. But it's not unexpected that you would find this in somebody's pocket, these keys, right? And I would, if I were a functionalist, I would want to relate these keys to every other aspect of my society and culture if I were going to study it from a functionalist perspective. Well, that's exhausting. You know, I did it with the buttons. I showed you how buttons were really related to this notion of fashion or style, how that in turn fits into a system of capitalistic values and attitudes that Americans have about the notions that of progress that we still retain, that if I have a coat with 4 buttons, it's somehow better than, intrinsically it's better than a coat with 2 buttons, and you're all acquainted with that as well, and so you would certainly not want to buy a coat with 2 buttons. Your coat or jacket would have to have 4 buttons, and even if you were more precise about it and you realized that this was a value system that people who sell coats buy into, for them it has that kind of interdependency and that kind of relevance. So whether I'm talking about keys or whether I'm talking about such mundane topics as buttons or ties, you know, that's another example that people often use in that same kind of context as I did buttons. I can always trace it to a larger set of values, a larger set of interdependencies that have nothing to do with its own historical, you know, I don't know why men have ties. I've forgotten the historical reason why ties are something that, you know, have come about and are considered to be an item of dress for males in this society and culture. You're not dressed up unless you either have a tie or a bow tie. I don't know why. I mean, those shirts they did have that had kind of a short-term popularity that just had the collar around, they seemed perfectly adequate to showing that somebody was dressed up to me. Back in my time, when I was a young man, we used to have those string ties. You know, had a kind of little metal thing here, and the 2 strings went through it. And even though that was considered Western or country or somehow whatever, a little negative, it was still considered to be an item of dress, and you could do that, or you could get away with it. But again, that dates me, doesn't necessarily give you insight. But that's just ways in which this model of behavior, they would take everything, they would talk about it exhaustively, they would try to they would show the interdependency of every item of that culture and society, from paper clips to political organization, And that, again, you can see, I think, that there would be subsequent criticism of that, because not everything is of equal value. But again, if you assume ahead of time that political systems somehow give you greater insight into the way in which another people think, you're making a kind of judgment that's before you've examined it. And that makes it less scientific, at least in the standardized model of what philosophy of science is about, and the scientific model of study is about, as it comes to the study of human behavior. So, as you can see, it's very complicated, but yet it's not that complicated. Functionalism is an approach that was originally developed by the colonial office, or the colonial office encouraged its development because it allowed them to justify the empire that they had. Well, let me answer that question first. Why? How did it justify an empire? Because it didn't take history into account. It didn't talk about exploitation. There are two elements, I think, that answer that or show functionalism as a model which allows the empire to continue. One is that it promotes the notion of society as harmonious, as being without conflict, as being the way things are. You know, we come into Africa, we don't try to intervene, we don't try to change the way that Africans are. If anything, we relate to Africans, British bureaucrat to African bureaucrat, and we don't try to penetrate or become a part of the African cultures that we were studying. In doing that, that allowed us to see them as not a product of history, but a product of the arrangement of the elements and the parts of that society as it was right then. The synchronic approach. Seeing it as interdependent, seeing it as ahistorical, seeing it as without change being a necessary part of the explanation. If you were to look at change, if you were to say, this is the way, say, the Talensi were, or one that's more often discussed as a cattle society or culture, if you will, if you can talk about culture and identify them with cows. In Eastern Africa, a lot of societies there, the Meru, for example, are much better known as a group because of that their whole society or culture was organized around cattle and their dependency on cattle and their religious rituals, their economics systems, their religious systems, everything. Cows that they had were right at the center of the action and were used and were functionally important in terms of discussing those societies. This is actually a difficult lecture for me to give because I'm using very little notes, and I apologize for that. But it's that I can't find them. I haven't been able to all semester, and so far I've done okay. In giving this view, this ahistorical, this non-historical, this giving no importance to change, you didn't really then have to talk about exploitation. You didn't have to take issues up of native people's rights. You didn't have to talk about the way in which agents of Western imperialism, and I'm using my words selectively here, you didn't have to talk about the ways in which these folks, these anthropologists, were a part of Western imperialism. And in doing that, you could remain apart from that. And certainly the functionalists remained, by and large, apart from that. And in doing so, they created their own criticism or subsequent criticism. You know, it's important. I'll say this because I'm an American anthropologist, and I think change is important to look at. It's fundamental to a notion of what American anthropology is about, And today, to a much larger extent, of what British anthropology is about. You know, in the face of 2 world wars, Korean conflict, Vietnam conflict, Desert Storm, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Today, Bosnia, Croatia, and all those places in the Balkans, the unsettling concept patterns of behavior that are changing in the Soviet Union. You know, we're a swirl with change and seeing the world in constant change and formation and reformation and reformation in historical times. And seeing these changes that are brought, we can't escape. Our discussions just automatically go that way. We're so linear. You know, our viewpoints, our mental imagery, our everything is linear. And so functionalism just isn't going to make it in a linear world. Because linearity necessarily implies a notion of history and taking history as part of your explanatory model. But functionalism didn't have that, and that's its major criticism. Or that's the major criticism that other people who were non-functionalists described functionalism. And again, I think it helped to kind of set the stage for the more widespread acceptance of a postmodern, what we'll know as later as a postmodern approach to the study of human behavior. Or studies of human behavior, since there is no one way of being postmodern. Organismic. Well, that's a characteristic. Again, I think there are 4 major characteristics to talk about under functionalism. If you discuss all 4, you have a pretty good notion of what functionalism is about. And I've given you 3 of them pretty much. Interdependent, it's ahistorical, and holistic. Now we're going to talk about organismic. And talking about organismic will importantly get us into a discussion of Radcliffe Brown's theoretical approach. The specifics of it. Again, you have to realize, or what I want to make you aware of, you don't have to realize, but what I want to make you aware of is that there is this tradition in social science, in science, of not distinguishing between biological models and social science models, in distinguishing between models of a presentation which importantly talk about somehow human groups as being something unique in the study of social sciences. They're not unique. The same models that were used to study biology, that were used to study organic kinds of systems, were then immediately transplanted over here for us, that allowed us or made us to have greater insight, we thought, into the study of human behavior. So human behaviors and a history of human behaviors in terms of models used to study human behavior has always importantly involved the study of biological models. Now, you know, any introductory course used to take into account, here's what biological systems have as their descriptions, here's what human societies have as their descriptions, and of course we know they have these distinctions. But it didn't work that way. I mean, they could certainly lay it out for you, and they would make you aware that they weren't confused by what was biology and what was culture. But yet, when they talked about the models that they employed, they importantly didn't make that distinction clear. So it was organismic. And again, I want you to get it correct, because I don't want you to confuse it with orgasmic, which might be the Great Bang Theory of culture if we had one. That's a joke. I expected greater laughter there. Organismic. And that's just, again, a fancy way of making an adjective out of organism, meaning a biological organism. And even though we could describe most models in social science as being organismic, functionalism is by and far more readily apparent that it's organismic in the way it's structured. And let's start with the way in which Malinowski talked about his concern with a comparative sociology, which is what he thought anthropology should be about. he was looking at societies and the way in which they were constructed, the way in which they were made. And he thought that the way in which societies were made or constructed was very similar, analogously speaking, by analogy, by metaphor, that it was the same way as a biological organism is constructed. So you got to remember their knowledge of biology was very limited compared to today, and their knowledge of physics was very limited compared to today. But picking up on the notions that they had that were contemporary for their time, they knew that the stuff of reality, the stuff of material out there, was made up of protons, neutrons, whatever I'm leaving out of that micro knowledge of biological reality. But they also knew that, in a much more immediate way, that organisms were made up of cells. That's something I'm sure most of you learned in grade school or primary school. In my time, it was called grade school. And you knew that cells function together to form, well, I've got cells here that form my dermatological, my skin, right? So they function together to form systems. Systems function together. I'm jumping ahead of myself. Cells function together to form organs. And I guess my skin could be considered an organ. My eyes could certainly be considered an organ. And they're made up of cells as a unit of structure. So you had cells, you had organs, you had the organs functioning together to form systems of my biological organism, that's my body, and you have those systems functioning together to form the entire organism. So again, this is a highly organismic model, which is a fancy way or a theoretical way that anthropologists have always said was a way of describing models using this term, but it really just means that it's heavily dependent or reliant upon biology as its source. So today we've begun our discussion, if you will, of functionalism as an approach which in many ways is extremely similar, as it turns out, to American anthropology and to cultural relativism. But the most important way, as I've emphasized, hopefully in this lecture, that it was distinctive from American anthropology and cultural relativism was its not taking into account any aspect of change or history, so that it is ahistorical. And it's that one characteristic that separates itself, makes it separate out from other approaches at that time to the study of contemporary society. The thing I'm going to give you as a prelude to next time's lectures, we're going to emphasize much more the way in which functionalism was used as a perspective, its limitations, and the way in which it was used by British anthropologists at this time. But they are